Long ago, before this day's confusion did begin, throughout the stars did we go wandering. Distance was no barrier, and time it had no hope. Free to come and free to go. Free to come and free to go. Open up the book of stars. Open up the
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Karmic Evolution's Astrologically Speaking podcast. I'm your host, Sheri Horn Hasan of Karmic Evolution Astrology, and I'm coming to you on March 10th, 2023 from Contact Talk Radio. Just a quick reminder that this show aims to bring you the truth about astrology and your soul's karmic evolution. First, my usual housekeeping stuff, which is to tell you that you can listen to Karmic Evolution's Astrologically Speaking podcast anytime by simply going to my website at KARMIC and clicking on the upper right-hand portion of the banner labeled podcast. And from there, you can scroll down the page, hear the most recent show, or search the archive listing for past shows that you might have missed or to which you'd like to listen again. And a quick reminder that the show drops now every Friday at 11 a.m. Pacific and 2 p.m. Eastern. So check it out. And while you're on that page, you'll see above the most recently posted show a downloadable freebie labeled How to Keep Your Sun Sign Happy, which is friendly advice for every sun sign from renowned evolutionary astrologer Stephen Forrest, who is one of my mentors, about what each of us, depending on our individual sun sign, actually needs to be happy. And this is based on an interview I did with Steve a couple of years ago. And as I've said before, he's given me permission to distribute it more widely as a means of promoting the validity of astrology in our lives. And yes, it will sign you up for my weekly Conversations About Consciousness astrology newsletter, but you can unsubscribe anytime, of course. So be sure to grab that when you listen to this podcast, whether you're doing it live or after the fact, and enjoy some words of astrological wisdom. Separately, you can always follow me on my Facebook page, which is Karmic Evolution for Your Soul, where you can keep track of upcoming podcast content and other astro news you can use. I post now on IG most of the time under karmic.evolution, so feel free to follow me there as well. And finally, I'm offering still my discounted now 75-minute Karmic Evolution Natal Insight reading for only $125 to radio show listeners only. So if you're interested in astrology and you want to learn more about the true meaning of your individual birth chart in order to gain greater consciousness about your soul's true mission and purpose in this lifetime, and you'd like to move from chaos to clarity about what might be holding you back from achieving, your most cherished desires and the areas of greatest interest to you. Could be relationship, could be career, job, could be finances, could be health. Then this is the reading for you. We'll look at how the energies into which you entered this lifetime may be keeping you stuck still in old habitual patterns, or what I call conditioned behavior, and how this knowledge can assist you to make different, newer, more positive choices moving forward. So if you'd like to co-create your own future happiness through astrological insight, that's easy when you take advantage of my special discounted offer at karmicevolution.com/karmic125. As I like to say, conscious awareness has never been so easy or so affordable. All right, so let's get down to this week's astro news you can use. We are in the waning phase currently of the monthly lunar cycle since the Virgo full moon occurred on March 7th. And that also happened to be the day, about an hour after this lunation perfected, that Saturn moved into watery, spiritual, empathic Pisces for the next 3 years. And that will be until he first dips his toe into Aries circa May 25th, 2025. But he'll then retrograde back into Pisces in September of 2025 until mid-February 2026, when he'll enter Aries for the next several years. So we're going to go back to talking about Saturn and Pisces in a few, but that's basically his trajectory for the next 3 years. But before I go a little bit deeper back into that again, let's first look at this just past Virgo full moon and how the Pisces sun's sextile to Uranus and Taurus just the day before on March 6th provided opportunities for a change in perspectives leading into this lunation. So when the Virgo moon opposed the Pisces sun, it called us and calls us still, since we're in the waning phase of this particular monthly lunar cycle right now, to move from chaos to clarity by releasing fantasies based on faulty perceptions, innuendo, and yes, maybe outright lies. So we may replace these falsehoods with hardcore, indisputably verifiable facts. And as I noted during last week's podcast, this lunation's mutable squares to Mars and Gemini were likely to spark anger from those previously duped by lies and or deceitful conspiracy theories, especially those spun by others motivated not by truth, but rather by greed and or a lust for power. Now, Saturn's entrance into the watery realm of our Piscean unconscious, again on March 7th, provides opportunities in a nutshell, and again I'll go back to it a little more in greater depth, for us to fearlessly bridge the gap between our empirically driven, just the facts ma'am ego orientation and what lies beneath our ego's boundary in our more intuitive unconscious realm, and that's the opportunity we're being given for the next 3 years or so. But meanwhile, a Venus-Mars sextile tomorrow on March 11th can allow us to capitalize on harmonizing our independent-oriented ego's will into the desire for more peaceful and fulfilling relationships. And Mercury's sextile to Uranus that day, too, can help us find new solutions to old problems, which can create, again, as I noticed last week, opportunities for revelations that help us exchange our old values for newer ones that are more appropriate to our current times. And this occurs as Jupiter meets wounded healer Chiron in Aries March 11th also, asking us to consider where our faith has been wounded in the past and how we can heal, moving forward to again trust that higher universal energies always have our backs. And it would seem to me, on a political level, that U.S. President Biden's recent announcement, he addressed the nation yesterday, I believe, according to the New York Times, quote, proposes the third budget of his presidency and his first to a divided Congress on, yesterday. The article continues, the $6.8 trillion budget plan seeks to increase spending on the military and a wide range of new social programs while also reducing future budget deficits. While Republican control of the House ensures the full blueprint has no chance of becoming law, it sets the stakes for a bigger fight over raising the federal debt limit and the nation's fiscal trajectory. This budget includes $5 trillion in proposed tax increases on high earners, that's those who earn more than $400,000 a year, and corporations over the course of a decade, mostly to offset new spending programs intended to help the middle class and the poor. Mr. Biden's plan also aims to reduce budget deficits by nearly $3 trillion over that time compared with the nation's current path. And also, in addition, according to the Times, and again I quote, Mr. Biden's proposal is the opening salvo in the battle over the debt ceiling, or the amount the Treasury is allowed to borrow to pay bills the government already incurred. The government has technically run out of money. The Treasury is delaying a default with accounting maneuvers, but those options will run out within months. Congress has to raise or suspend the limit to avoid a default. But Republicans want to cut future spending before agreeing to do so. End quote. So, and this is me speaking, the fact that President Biden's budget may seem fantastical, pie in the sky, huge, overlooks the fact that such hyperbole may be designed to force an unrealistic starting point from which to begin negotiations with the knowledge that it's better to shoot for the moon and over-exaggerate than to underestimate. After all, this is what every realtor does for their client when they help them sell a house, right? It's well known in the real estate industry that one should ask for at least 15% above what one expects to actually sell for in order to leave room for the back and forth negotiations that will result in a final sale price. So in other words, if you ask for a certain price, you're always going to get lower because someone's always going to negotiate with you. So if you ask for a higher price, it's always going to come out to be what the market will bear, but you stand a better chance of getting closer to what in your mind is your actual asking price. And that's one of the things that I think that Biden is doing. But finally, further, this occurs, that his budget proposal was put out on the eve of the Jupiter-Chiron conjunction in Aries, which, as I said, is tomorrow, and with Venus still close by, mirrors at least one attempt to heal the wounds of the lingering, overexpanded political philosophy that government austerity proves beneficial for the masses via the now long denounced and disproven trickle-down economics theory espoused by former President Ronald Reagan and his Federal Reserve Chairman Alan Greenspan back during the 1980s. Now, because so many U.S. citizens jumped onto that bandwagon, denigrating people as welfare queens and others who suck at the teat of the government's coffers, many now still seem to carry these same values without actually accepting that circumstances have now changed and that some of these values are based on former beliefs set during a different time, no longer rest on solid data. So Biden's budget proposal is part of the way to heal by righting this philosophy's wrongs and by asking those more than capable of contributing to the government's coffers through higher taxes to pay their fair share. I mean, it's easy to Google and research, how many of the country's corporations pay what percentage of taxes, et cetera, et cetera. There's lots of statistics out there, so all one has to do is look for it. But just as anger at the lies and deceit from the hosts and others at the Fox News network, which is something we spoke about last week, continues to grow, especially as Mars in Gemini waxes towards its exact square to Neptune in Pisces next week on March 14th, where we'll likely see additional tales spun that rely on old, outdated philosophies clung to by those who still believe that such governmental austerity actually works for the betterment of all. And I'll just mention that this whole government austerity thing swept the globe at the time in the 80s and the 90s. This was not something that simply affected Americans. It affected many other countries, especially in Europe, and particularly places like Greece, where they defaulted on their debt. So these things, again, it's yesteryear at this point. But anyway, the Mercury square, was it Mercury? Yeah, Mars square Neptune. I'm thinking this will undoubtedly cause anger on both sides, from those who refuse to move toward changed values that are more in accordance with current times, and those who are pissed off at how this older set of values has not yet been replaced by newer ones within the collective. So, the reality of this transit, or this particular transit, is that it can cause us to feel discouraged and doubtful as we may be confronted with the consequences of past actions that we'd hope would simply go away. right? So in other words, changing policy or doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results, yada, yada, right? Now, the Sun's conjunction to Neptune in Pisces occurs on March 15th and is then followed by Mercury's conjunction to Neptune on March 16th. And these grant us the ability to learn more about the deeper truths hidden behind the appearances of the everyday mundane world. And the Sun-Neptune aspect helps us feel other people's pain, helps us walk a mile in other people's shoes, while the Mercury-Neptune one allows us expression in more subtle ways, such as through image and art. Both, however, have a downside. The former aspect including the need to escape from the harsher, more painful realities of life, while the latter can make us prone to illusory thinking. So which way we respond to these particular transits, of course, is going to depend on the energies in our natal charts, but which way we do is going to depend on each of us. That these aspects are waxing at the same time that we're waxing into the March 14th monthly third quarter lunar cycle's waning square of the Sagittarius moon to the Pisces sun, they set the stage for us to proactively push through this month's challenges, to review old issues, but to consider now taking new actions and to apply different solutions. So any newly proposed actions, say, for example, like President Biden's new budget proposal. Remember, Jupiter and Chiron, Jupiter is expansion, but it's also, it's not that it's money per se, but, since Jupiter and Venus aligned not that long ago last week, now we have Jupiter Chiron. It was Venus and Jupiter and then Venus and Chiron. The money aspect is always still lingering here, right? So, as I was saying, any new proposed actions, such as Biden's new budget proposal, for example, are likely to face great oppositional challenges as Venus in Aries squares Pluto in Capricorn and Mercury in Pisces squares Mars in Gemini on March 16th. So this could well become a time when pushing ahead to adapt new rules may well be met by those who continue to espouse, again, not to, wear out my welcome by using the same terminology, but, by those who continue to espouse old, outdated, traditional ones in the collective, especially any new values that would result in societal reform, because that's what Pluto actually stands for. We're seeing this now, and Pluto in Capricorn, of course, Capricorn is business, right? So we're seeing this kind of thing being set up now in the recent announcement by the Walgreens drugstore chain to not to fill prescriptions for mifepristone, which is known as the morning after abortion pill, because of restrictions in on such sales in 21 U.S. states and possibly counting. So California Governor Newsom's counter to this announcement, again, as we approach tomorrow's Jupiter-Chiron conjunction in Aries, is to try to heal this wound to societal values by severing $54 million in contracts between the state and Walgreens. So California will cease all its business with Walgreens, the retail drugstore chain. According to Gavin Newsom, he announced that just days after the company announced it would not dispense the abortion medication in, as I mentioned, 21 Republican-dominated states. And according to CNN, California, I quote, "California won't be doing business with Walgreens or any company that cowers to the extremists and puts women's lives at risk," the Democratic governor tweeted. "We're done." Newsom's office announced Wednesday that California would be pulling back a renewal of a $54 million contract with Walgreens that would have taken effect on May 1st, 2023. The state will explore other options, quote, "for furnishing the same services," his office said. And CNN goes on and says, Walgreens Senior Director for External Relations, Fraser Engerman, said in a statement Wednesday that the company was deeply disappointed with the announcement and said that the decision not to renew was made off of false and misleading information. Well, that's exactly the perfect kind of response one would expect when we're looking at the waxing Mercury and Pisces square to Mars and Chatty Gemini perfecting next week on the 16th. An aspect that can result in delays in any kind of negotiation or compromises, and can also cause, of course, the aforementioned anger that leads into future or further arguments. Let me go back now to Saturn's journey through Pisces, or the new archetypal energy through which the symbol of our ego is traveling, making the contrast between earthy empirical Saturn's need for a secure foundation in the more amorphous, less defined territory of Pisces, what Pisces symbolizes most, which is the ocean. As we know, Neptune ruled Pisces is also the ruler of the natural 12th house in all of our charts. So all themes Neptunian and Piscean relate to this archetypal domain. And that includes, as mentioned before, dreams, fantasies, and places of exile, such as prisons, monasteries, hospitals, etc. And this archetypal energy, and yes, as an evolutionary and psychological astrologer, I connect the meaning of a sign not only with its ruler, but with the house that its ruler naturally rules, which in this case, as I said, is Neptune in the 12th house, that this represents all of our individual unconsciousnesses. So since Saturn's our conscious ego, meaning the beliefs we hold of which we're aware, often because we feel we have concrete proof based on our physical senses of sight, hearing, touch, taste, and smell. When we combine Saturn with Pisces, we're faced with a dichotomy. And that's because if Saturn has trouble believing anything that it cannot actually prove exists in the physical, empirical, logical, rational, earthy world, it tends to dismiss it. And worse yet, Saturn erects boundaries around letting in any information that does not confirm the beliefs it's developed that it originally registered through its physical senses only. So Saturn in Pisces can be a time when many of us open up to widening the inclusion of more metaphysical beliefs into our psyches. Now, I realize I may be preaching to the choir. This is, after all, a podcast about astrology, which is, if it's not a metaphysical practice, it's not a practice at all. However, I just want to, lay this out, the bare bones facts, that this transit can also represent a time when many shut down the possibility that energies we cannot see for ourselves proves that they do not exist. And then Saturn, which can be judgmental, of course, in mythology, Saturn was the judge, right? May decide any number of things, that believing in metaphysics, which can help us access other dimensions intuitively, again, through dreams, premonitions, and other sights, sounds, touches, tastes, etc., has no, and by that I mean zero, none, validity to our lives here on terra firma. So Saturn becomes resistant, guarded, restrictive, and generally naysaying. But meanwhile, he's transiting through Pisces, which seeks to dissolve boundaries between what's real and what's unreal, or the real and the unreal, however you want to term it. But when we keep in mind that Mars' recent and current long journey transiting through Gemini since August of 2022, and that Mars is still in Gemini now until he moves into Taurus on March 25th, I thought it interesting when I came across a recent video, which some of you may have seen, and if you haven't, I strongly recommend it, by the athlete, actor, and former California Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger, in which I thought he gave voice to a lot of current astrological energies, including, of course, the Mars and Gemini transit, but also this upcoming and, just starting Saturn in Pisces, when he spoke out against the current rise of anti-Semitism in the world. Now, remember, he did this also, and I believe he released a video a little over 2 years ago, which was right after the January 6th insurrection. But he did so again. He reiterated some of what he'd previously said, but I thought that it bears repeating here as an example of the archetypal energies currently in play. As part of his address, Arnold Schwarzenegger said, "It is easier to hate than it is to learn. It's easier when someone challenges you to get hurt feelings and go and find some echo chamber that tells that you are right and they are wrong. But easy isn't better. When you spend your life looking for scapegoats, you take away your own responsibility. You remove your own power. You steal your own strength." And this, of course, again, I believe resonates with the energy inherent in Saturn's current journey through Pisces, since Saturn represents responsibility, and Neptune-ruled Pisces can relate to playing the victim or blaming others for one's own misfortune, rather than being mature enough to acknowledge that ultimate responsibility lies with each of us as individuals. And Schwarzenegger continues, and here I quote, "Choose a life of strength, but you have to give up a war against the color of others' skin, their religion, their gender, or sexual orientation. It doesn't matter. Give it up. The war you really have to fight is the war against yourself. It's not easy to look in the mirror and change your life. You have to responsibly learn new things. You have to feel uncomfortable. That's how we grow, how we become strong. If you want to grow as a person," he continues, "you really have to make friends with pain. Embrace the struggle. Enjoy the pain." We all know that one of Saturn's mottos is no pain, no gain, right? Schwarzenegger continues, "You have to force your brain to think in new ways. If you really want to get stronger, you have to embrace the pain. Eventually, you'll then become empowered. The other path is much easier," he notes. "Don't have to change anything. Everything you're unhappy about can be somebody else's fault. And then, and I'm paraphrasing a little here, you can exist on the sugar high of, blaming others for the rest of your life," he cautioned. So again, I think each of us can extrapolate from his words the meaning of Saturn's journey through Pisces, especially since it's beginning almost as Mars is moving out of Gemini through his long 7-month journey there, which included, of course, his retrograde. I'm going to touch on that in a few in relation to something else I'm going to talk about, so hang in there. But, we'll undoubtedly be looking at the Saturn and Pisces and tracking his journey as the year goes on. So just to go back to the Virgo full moon for a second, let's remember that the moon represents our emotional security in general. That's for all of us, right? And the people, quote unquote, or the public in mundane astrology. And that means the less that the Pisces sun at this full moon confesses to having made up some of its fantastical stories, the more the Virgo moon will likely retaliate by trying to control the sun's future expression. Alternatively, the more the Pisces sun feels controlled, the more it may double down on insisting its stories are accurate and that it's telling the truth, which I thought was a wonderful lead-in to bring me to a discussion of the chart of Tucker Carlson, who's currently caught in the crossfires of the lawsuit brought by Dominion Voting Systems against Fox. So Carlson, who was born May 16th of 1969 at 10:07 a.m. in San Francisco, California, is a Taurus new moon baby with his 11th house sun at 25 degrees and 38 minutes and his moon at 29 degrees and 42 minutes of the sign of the bull. Both luminaries oppose his natal 5th house Neptune at 27 degrees and 23 minutes of Scorpio. So both being born in the dark, well, being born in the dark of the moon, but as it's waxing, can make one intuitive. For example, someone who feels their way through the dark. And this might be echoed by the fact that the moon rules Carlson's Cancer ascendant. Now, the Sun-Moon oppositions to Neptune, however, depict someone who started out in this lifetime without a very strong sense of his own ego identity. And that usually stems from a lack of a true relationship or support from the father, who may have either been physically absent during one's childhood, and that can occur for a myriad number of reasons, or who was present but proved to be emotionally unavailable nonetheless. Now, Solar Fire Astrology software chart interpretation defines a Sun-Neptune opposition thusly, quote, you allow other people to tell you how to live your life because of your own lack of confidence. You have a pleasing nature and wouldn't dream of upsetting other people. Your challenge is to use your artistic and sensitive nature for the benefit of other people without losing yourself. Spending time on your own could be helpful. So the general assumption here is that this person lacks ego boundaries, which in turn allows him to absorb energy from the egos of others. This is a type of person who may exhibit chameleon-like tendencies, such as taking on the attributes, whether they're physical, mental, emotional, etc., of others, because their ego boundaries are so porous. So when we delve into Carlson's history, we learn from Wikipedia that his father was in fact an orphan because, quote, Carlson's paternal grandparents were Richard Boynton and Dorothy Anderson, who were teenagers when they placed his father at the Home for Little Wanderers orphanage near Boston. Carlson's father was adopted at the age of 2 by upper-middle-class New Englanders, the Carlsons, an executive at the Winslow Brothers and Smith Tannery of Norwood, the oldest tannery in America, and his wife, end quote. So some of this disconnect with his father, who, as noted, clearly lacked strong confidence in his son's capabilities, it's a sort of an ancestral thing here, right? Because his father grew up without his biological father, and so perhaps he lacked that strong ego connection with his dad, and then was unable to pass on a strong ego connection with his own son because of that. So we can glean how this might have played out from something that's written in Wikipedia, and here I quote again. After college, Carlson tried to join the Central Intelligence Agency, but his application was denied, after which he decided to pursue a career in journalism with the encouragement of his father, who advised him that, quote, they'll take anybody. Prior to that, however, when he was much younger, as per Wikipedia, and again I quote, in 1976, Carlson's parents divorced after the 9-year marriage reportedly turned sour. Carlson's father was granted custody of Tucker and his brother. Carlson's mother left the family when he was 6, wanting to pursue a, quote, bohemian lifestyle. So when we turn to Carlson's Taurus moon opposite Neptune in Scorpio, we learn this from Solar Fire. And again, I quote, you are drawn to unusual people. Positively, these people may be spiritual and artistic, or negatively, they may be confused and drunk. You may idealize other people and need to be more realistic. The conflict is that you want to be at one with the universe and yet cannot be until you have a clear idea of your identity. The lesson is to recognize your own artistic and spiritual potential. So again, we see two messages, because both of the luminaries are opposite Neptune, that this is a person who didn't have a strong sense of himself. And we get this interpretation also from renowned astrologer Rob Hand's Planets in Transit. And remember, this book is delineating the fact, it's not only transits to your chart now as an older person, but the fact that these planets were transiting at the exact moment and location of Carlson's birth mean they influence him for life. So he says, Rob Hand says that the moon opposite Neptune is, quote, very sensitive emotionally, but the impressions you receive through your sensitivity may not be very accurate. You have vague feelings about the circumstances and people around you, and you may feel very confused because you aren't sure whether you're being realistic. And Han continues, the source of the problem is that this activates your subconscious complexes, which take over your moods and perceptions. Instead of reacting to the reality of what you see, you react automatically to the subconscious process set off by what you see. So we may also note that on an evolutionary level, meaning the evolution of Tucker Carlson's soul during this particular lifetime, that he came in with Pluto and Jupiter in Virgo, conjoined to his third house Virgo south node on one side, and Uranus in Libra conjoined on the other. Now, in modern astrology, Uranus is often considered a planet that can denote trauma. So we read it oftentimes as a trauma signature. And I'd ask anyone listening whether they think that a 6-year-old child abandoned by his mother, who'd rather pursue a bohemian lifestyle than stay home and raise her children, and I'm not being judgmental about that, I'm saying basically be with her children, nurture them, support them, raise them, or help raise them, that this person has experienced some level of trauma, and whether this might be compounded by his father having been abandoned as well by both of his parents early in his life. So what we might notice next in terms of what's been going on relative to his chart is that transiting Mars in Gemini has been squaring Carlson's third house Pluto, which is 22 degrees and 28 minutes of Virgo, off and on since it entered Gemini back on August 20th of 2022. Now, since that date, transiting Mars stationed retrograde at 25 degrees and 36 minutes of Gemini, square to his natal Pluto, and that retrograde station was on October 30th of 2022. So transiting Mars direct before its station retrograde first opposed Carlson's natal fifth house Neptune, and the fact that his Neptune is situated in his fifth house is another indication of a Sun-Neptune combination of energies. Since the fifth house is naturally ruled by the Sun, you'll see the zodiacal sign Leo there. But the signs, as I've said before, don't rule houses, the planets do. So the Sun rules Neptune. And the fact that, so Mars, again, directly opposed his natal Neptune in the fifth house from his 11th house, and then crossed over his Taurus Sun and Moon in the week or so prior to its entrance into Gemini. So that would be slightly before that August 20th date. But transiting Mars then squared Carlson's natal Pluto just as Mars entered his 12th house, and then stationed retrograde again at 2536 Gemini on October 30th of last year. So we might note that Carlson's natal Jupiter is at 26 degrees, 18 minutes of Virgo, conjoined to his natal Pluto. And this means that transiting Mars effectively squared both his Pluto and his Jupiter simultaneously, since when a transit's within a 1-degree orb, its energies are usually considered to be activated. Now, Mars square Pluto is a recipe for power struggles and disagreements, when either others are trying to control you or you're trying to control or overpower others. Inherent in this energy is coercion through manipulation, and since Carlson's Pluto-Jupiter conjunction sits in his Mercury-ruled third house, okay, Mercury's Gemini third house, we can easily see which route Carlson took. Clearly, it was that of manipulating others, which might be reflected then by the fact that transiting Mars had entered his 12th house, which is naturally ruled, as I've said before, by Neptune, which is known in psychological astrology as the planet of illusion, confusion, and delusion, and that he manipulated others how? Via communication that may have begun based on information from those who are, as Rob Hand says, either spiritual and artistic or confused and drunk. I'm sorry, not Rob Hand, but Solar Fire tells us. So for those who don't know, which might be surprising at this point, it was actually Maria Bartiromo on Fox channel who put Sidney Powell on first, but and Sidney Powell, of course, for those of us who remember and some of us who can't forget, is the one who said that the Dominion voting systems machines were rigged, and that's why Trump lost the election. But what happened was that Maria Bartiromo knew when she questioned Sidney Powell that this information had come to her via a woman who basically, I think in our terminology as metaphysicists, would qualify as a psychic. But, not all psychics get it right. So she claimed that she got this information from a woman who time traveled and who could talk to the wind and things like that. And don't get me wrong, I'm not poo-pooing this stuff. A lot of us have psychic, tendencies and psychic abilities and gifts and aptitudes. I talk a lot about that on this show. So I'm not downplaying that. However, it is a fact that Maria Bartiromo, as a news person, normally what we would do as news people is go to the source. There's a saying in media, it's like go to the source. You don't take a story from someone secondhand. You always go to the primary source. So that wasn't done. And even though Bartiromo, through these texts and things that have recently been released, obviously thought that Sidney Powell was nuts, as did many of these other people, including Tucker Carlson, she still put her on the air. Okay? So the point here is that Tucker Carlson's propensity to either believe or not believe something that's based on false information, but that he continues to stand by it, shows, again, his lack of commitment to his own belief system and his propensity to hang out with or be associated with those who aren't quite grounded. So what's been in play for him over these past 7 months or so while Mars has been in Gemini is that Mars hit his natal 11th house Mercury at 11 degrees and 58 minutes of Gemini, which is the ruler of his third house Virgo South Node, which denotes that he came into this lifetime likely having been subjected to a lot of criticism, and that therefore he seeks to, well, number one, if you're subjected to a lot of criticism either early in this lifetime or past life karma, you tend to become what you didn't like, which is you become critical, right? So that Virgo South Node is critical, sometimes in a positive way, sometimes in a negative way, but we're looking at the negatives here, which is what we usually do when we're evaluating or delineating a person's chart through the evolutionary lens. But also, when one comes in with a South Node in Virgo, we generally know that in some way that person's life was chaotic early on. And so here I would say, positing that Tucker Carlson's life was chaotic, maybe this is a bit sarcastic, but I'm like, you think? I mean, picture little Tucker at 6 years of age waving bye-bye to his bohemian mom as she flows off, into the car or the train or the plane or whatever, which, took her away. And I don't know if they saw each other again after that. I don't have any information on that. But still, it can't not be traumatic when your mother abandons you, right? And so that transiting Mars hit his natal his natal Mercury in Gemini, again, the ruler of his Virgo South Node, around September 11th of last year, 2022. Transiting Mars then hit that point again around December 20th, 2022, while retrograde, and then one more time again after Mars had stationed direct, but that third hit occurred February 7th of 2023. Now, likewise, Mars continued its forward movement to re-square his Pluto around March 7th or 8th. Oh, what was that? That was the day of this past week's Virgo full moon and the Saturn's entrance into Pisces. So as the public began to learn not only of the testimony under oath of Fox hosts, including Tucker Carlson and other Fox employees, including, of course, Fox CEO Rupert Murdoch, about how none of them believed former President Trump's big lie around election fraud, but nonetheless continued to push it by allowing onto their shows election deniers such as people like Sidney Powell, Rudy Giuliani, and many, many others. Now, in addition, the subsequent disclosure of internal texts, and some of that happened just, I think, on the night of the full moon and the next day, these were texts that were revealed by Dominion, or the court, I guess, that had been obtained by Dominion as part of its lawsuit against Fox. These are texts that were sent back and forth between Fox News hosts like Carlson and the others internally that verified, beyond a shadow of a doubt, factually, that their disbelief, in what they were reporting was real. And then, of course, subsequently, as we reached the Virgo full moon, or even before that, the anger around that has become, the anger and the outcry has become palpable. So what I want to say is that today, on March 10th, transiting Mars is at 23 degrees of Gemini, just past Carlson's 22.5 degree Virgo Pluto, and coming up to square his 26 Jupiter, and then his 27 South Node and North Node. So he's going to be, Mars, transiting Mars is going to be squaring his natal nodes. Is that this will all happen between now and March 21st. So let me read to you some of the delineation by author Celeste Teal, who wrote the book Lunar Nodes, Discover Your Soul's Karmic Mission. And in it, she delineates the transits of planets to the nodes. And although she doesn't specifically talk about their squares to the nodes, she does say that a square to the nodes by a planet is similar to their conjunction to the south node. So if we're looking at Mars and we're realizing that the square of Mars to Carlson's chart, which is coming up in the next 2 weeks or so, we can see that her delineation sounds pretty right on. So here's what she says. Things are not going your way. There may be confrontations or differences of opinion, and someone is asking you to make compromises that annoy you. Great effort is required to control impatience, aggression, and anger. Encounters tend to be difficult and sap your energy. Others need you to take action on their behalf, and you can spread yourself thin. You may be dealing with unsatisfactory results of past actions and decisions. Once again, ya think? Health issues may surface. The matters of the house ruled by Mars experience a downshift or suffer upsetting elements. And if Mars goes retrograde, there can be several passes, which have already happened, but not to the nodes yet. So the house ruled by Mars in Tucker Carlson's chart, guess what, is the 10th house. Career, wider world, reputation. All right, so that's a very interesting thing to keep track of, because those of us who are following the news also know that despite the fact that all of this has been revealed within the past few days to the past week in terms of the Dominion trial, we know that he has doubled down because he took the 40,000 hours of video recordings from the Capitol Police that were released to him by Kevin McCarthy, the House Majority Speaker, which all the other media channels have been clamoring about, right? So he is continuing to cherry pick scenes from the Capitol riot and insurrection from January 6th of 2021 to actually claim that it was peaceful and doubles down on that. So let's wait to see what happens when Mars exact squares his nodes, because that's going to be a pivotal time for him. Now, I thought, interestingly enough, that Tucker Carlson's recently revealed text, which, admonished lawyer Sidney Powell for spreading false information about Dominion's election machinery and saying how awful it is that she was misleading their audience, who are made up of basically of good, decent people. It reminded me of Lewis Carroll's poem, The Walrus and the Carpenter. And we have only a few minutes left, so I'm going to ask you to indulge me, because it flashed me back to childhood. I do remember either reading this in a class in grammar school or reading it on my own. I don't know. But The Walrus and the Carpenter, for those of you who don't know, is a narrative poem by Lewis Carroll, which appears in his book Through the Looking Glass, which was published in December of 1871. And the poem is recited in chapter 4 by the characters Tweedledee and Tweedledum to Alice, which is, yes, Alice of Alice in Wonderland, as follows. The sea was shining on the sea, shining with all his might. He did his very best to make the billows smooth and bright, and this was odd, because it was the middle of the night. The moon was shining sulkily, because she thought the sun had got no business to be there after the day was done. It's very rude of him, she said, to come and spoil the fun. The sea was wet as wet could be. The sands were dry as dry. You could not see a cloud, because no cloud was in the sky. No birds were flying overhead. There were no birds to fly. The Walrus and the Carpenter were walking close at hand. They wept like anything to see such quantities of sand. If this were only cleared away, they said, it would be grand. If 7 maids with 7 mops swept it for half a year, do you suppose, the Walrus said, that they could get it clear? I doubt it, said the Carpenter, and shed a bitter tear. Oh, oysters, come and walk with us, the Walrus did beseech. A pleasant walk, a pleasant talk along the briny beach. We cannot do with more than 4 to give a hand to each. The eldest oyster looked at him, but never a word he said. The eldest oyster winked his eye and shook his heavy head, meaning to say that he did not choose to leave the oyster bed. But 4 young oysters hurried up, all eager for the treat. Their coats were brushed, their faces washed, their shoes were clean and neat. And this was odd, because, they hadn't any feet. 4 other oysters followed them, and yet another 4, and thick and fast they came at last, and more and more and more, all hopping through the frothy waves and scrambling to the shore. The Walrus and the Carpenter walked on a mile or so, and then they rested on a rock conveniently low, and all the little oysters stood and waited in a row. The time has come, the Walrus said, to talk of many things, of shoes and ships and sealing wax, of cabbages and kings, and why the sea is boiling hot, and whether pigs have wings. But wait a bit, the oysters cried, before we have our chat, for some of us are out of breath, and all of us are fat. No hurry, said the Carpenter. They thanked him much for that. A loaf of bread, the Walrus said, is what we chiefly need. Pepper and vinegar, besides, are very good indeed. Now, if you're ready, oysters dear, we can begin to feed. But not on us, the oysters cried, turning a little blue. After such kindness, that would be a dismal thing to do. The night is fine, the Walrus said. Do you admire the view? It was so kind of you to come, and you are very nice. The Carpenter said nothing, but cut us another slice. I wish you were not quite so deaf. I've had to ask you twice. It seems a shame, the Walrus said, to play them such a trick, after we've brought them out so far and made them trot so quick. The Carpenter said nothing, but the butter's spread too thick. I weep for you, the Walrus said. I deeply sympathize. With sobs and tears he sorted out those of the largest size, holding his pocket handkerchief before his streaming eyes. Oh, oysters, said the Carpenter, you've had a pleasant run. Shall we be trotting home again? But answer came there none. And this was scarcely odd, because they'd eaten every one. So I'm hoping that you can understand the resonance of this poem, which, as an English literature major, I don't even think when I was studying literature, I don't remember if we knew that Lewis Carroll was also a pedophile, but that comes down to an argument about whether you're going to separate the artist from his art, But anyway, there's more here because it says from Through the Looking Glass, after hearing the poem, the good-natured Alice attempts to determine which of the two leading characters might be the more sympathetic, but is thwarted by the twins' further interpretation. And this is Tweedledee and Tweedledum, because they're the ones who I think tell her the story. So she says, I like the walrus best, said Alice, because you see he was a little sorry for the poor oysters. And this reminds me of Tucker Carlson being so sorry for the viewers of his Fox show because they actually believed the liars that he himself put on the air. Quote, he ate more than the carpenter, though, said Tweedledee. You see, he held his handkerchief in front so that the carpenter couldn't count how many he took, contrariwise. That was mean, Alice said indignantly. Then I like the carpenter best, if he didn't eat so many as the walrus. But he ate as many as he could, said Tweedledum. This was a puzzler. After a pause, Alice began, well, they were both very unpleasant characters. And so I would like to leave you with that to ponder or just enjoy for the sake of having listened to a poem. Meanwhile, thank you, everyone, for joining me today. I hope you found the information presented here helpful as you continue your karmic evolution in this lifetime. Let's see, and you join me next week on March 17th, if this absurdity continues, and we get even more clear about where we've been lied to, or things have been misrepresented to us, or, people who knew the truth decided they weren't going to tell it. But anyway, for another episode of this podcast. Till then, may your journey be filled with karmic healing and the joy of greater consciousness. Namaste.
Long ago, before this day's confusion did begin, throughout the stars did we go wandering. Distance was no barrier, and time it had no hope. Free to come and free to go. Free to come and free to go. Open up the book.